Hello and welcome to the Captain's Table. I'm your host, Dawn Deckman-Moeller. The Captain's Table podcast is your passport to a captivating blend of insight and entertainment, drawing inspiration from the maritime tradition where a captain invites the most interesting minds for elevated discussions through life's thrilling journeys. The Captain's Table is a voyage through time and across topics, where the truth is our North Star and laughter is the wind in our sails. Today, our guest is Paul Mitchell. Paul Mitchell is the owner of Redistricting Partners, where he has conducted the redistricting of states, cities, school boards, and community college districts, more than 100 in total, including the State of New York Independent Redistricting Commission, the Los Angeles City Council Redistricting Commission, the Long Beach Independent Redistricting Commission, commissions in Oakland, Berkeley, and Mesa, Arizona. His firm's work on racially polarized voting analysis and demographics has aided dozens of agencies as they navigate the California and federal voting rights acts. Mitchell also works with nonprofit organizations such as Irvine Foundation, American Civil Liberties Union, the Advancement Project, Common Cause, Election Reformers, and others in building community engagement and working throughout California and nationally on elections and voting issues, including advising in the state of New Mexico's inaugural Redistricting Commission, working with the State Ethics Committee on guidelines for commissioners and evaluating the final maps. In total, Mitchell and his firm has worked in more than 15 states around the country, advising on statewide redistricting. Mitchell has been regularly cited in the media as an expert on elections and redistricting, including as the subject of a CNN Presents special on the decennial redistricting process, being interviewed on the PBS NewsHour election coverage in 2020, participating in the 538 podcast series on redistricting reform, and as a regular analyst on California-based network TV election coverage. For the past 15 years, Mitchell has also served as Vice President of Political Data, where he works with campaigns, nonprofits, and universities, with a specialty in polling and survey data. Mitchell earned his associate degree from Orange Coast College, an undergraduate from American University, and a master's in public policy from USC. Goodness, I got a little tongue-tied there, but I'm so happy you're here. Welcome, Paul. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
We are so happy to have you, and especially with this show, because in a couple of days, when this show is airing, Californians will be going to the polls, and this is an opportunity for our audience to learn about the history of redistricting, how it all came about, what the current landscape is looking like, and what you need to know to equip yourselves when you go to the polls in November. So, Paul, you and I talked earlier. We thought it would make a lot of sense for people to really kind of get their arms around Prop 50 and the history of the mapping of districts in, areas in the United States. So I'm going to let you go ahead and share with our audience everything that we need to know. Let's start with the history of it. You are an expert, and let's go.
Sure. Well, the history of it, we could go back 200 years and chart the course to how we got from Governor Gerry, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a vice president of the United States who is only known for one thing, and that is a salamander-shaped set of districting lines that we call the gerrymander. We couldn't even keep his name right. It's gerrymander because it was Governor Gerry, but nevertheless,
I didn't know that. That's
a little history there.
That's a lot of history there. Now we know where the gerrymander was his name.
Well, his name was Governor Elbridge Gerry.
Okay.
Gerry. But the name has been kind of morphed over the last 200 years, where we call it the gerrymander, kind of like the argument between whether you call it a GIF or a GIF.
Yes.
We call it gerrymander or gerrymander, but the real nerds will call it a gerrymander just to peacock their, intimate knowledge of, history from more than 200 years ago. But the idea of the original gerrymander is interesting in that what it shows was that even 2 centuries ago, people who were drawing districts for elections were figuring out ways to manipulate the lines, manipulate the process, manipulate the creation of these districts in a number of different ways in order to achieve a political gain. And we most commonly think about these as partisan gains, because that's what we think about as redistricting, as gerrymandering, as people. And that's what we're seeing in these redistrictings when Donald Trump goes into Texas and says, I need 5 more districts. He's not saying I need 5 more districts for people who have an agricultural interest. He's saying I need 5 more districts for people who are Republicans. Mm-hmm. And so we think about that in modern gerrymandering. But gerrymandering also includes things like racial gerrymandering, which is also one of the things that they're accusing folks of in Texas and in other states where they are, drawing districts in a way, specifically designing districts in a way that will disenfranchise, Black or Latino voters or even Asian voters, depending on where you are in the country. But there's even more. I mean, there's California's history is really interesting because folks might not know this, but we used to have district drawing in California that was based on counties, right? Not population. And so like LA would have one state senator, and then there'd be a state senator for like Alpine, Nevada counties together. They'd get a state senator with like 2,000 people, and LA County would get a state senator with like 500,000 people.
So let me ask you a quick question. So I'm from Burbank, California. I know Burbank was not a part of LA. Does Burbank have their separate seat? So
it used to be back in like pre-1963 that the state Senate was drawn without any population equality.
Got it.
So you'd have some districts that would be super huge with tons of people. It was actually a big fight. The political fighting point in the 1960s redistrictings and prior to that was the rural areas of the state versus the urban areas, and not wanting to give more legislators to the cities versus the agricultural counties. And so you had this very disproportionate political strength for kind of rural counties with not a lot of population. But this is just a long-winded way of saying that the redistricting history is long, and the things that are being fought over can vary. It can be redistricting as a way to advantage a political party, as to advantage or disadvantage a racial group, to advantage or disadvantage a particular interest, like the agricultural inland communities versus the cities. Like there's all these other things that can be done. As long as we have districted election systems and people kind of know what they're doing, districts can be drawn to advantage or disadvantage groups. And one of the things that Californians did in 2008 and again in 2010 was essentially rejected the idea of politicians using districts as a way to, lock in political power or advantage their party or, advantage incumbents or whatever it is they're trying to do, and give that power to an independent commission, which for the last 2 decades, the legislative lines and the congressional lines for the state have been drawn by a commission. And when that was implemented in California, a lot of folks, including a lot of folks that I've worked with and worked for in kind of the nonprofit space, thought, aha, California's created this perfect system. We're going to take it nationally. And some states did embrace that. So like Michigan went to an independent redistricting commission that's most closely similar to California. New York created one that was a little bit different. Other states created them on kind of a spectrum of California being the gold standard to, some commissions where, politicians are appointing the commissioners and it's kind of a little bit more window dressing.
Okay.
But we've had this more recent history of redistricting being, put into these kind of good government kind of commission structures. Now, when somebody's looking at their ballot this weekend and they're voting on Tuesday, most people aren't going to be walking to the polls pondering Governor Gerry and, the pre-1963 redistrictings in California. They're going to be thinking about what's happening today. And what's happening today is that we have an unprecedented move nationally of being pushed by President Donald Trump to redraw districts to favor him leading into this midterm election, because as observers know, in elections, oftentimes when somebody wins the presidency, the midterm election right after it is kind of a rebound for the other party. And you oftentimes see a Democrat take the White House and then lose congressional seats in the next election. And Donald Trump did take the White House in 2016 and lost Congress and lost a lot of seats in 2018 in a big blue wave. So a way to defend against that for Donald Trump was to redraw districts in advance of the 2026 election. That's what he started.
This is really fascinating. We are going to take a real quick break for our sponsors, so please stand by. We'll be right back.
For anyone who's worried about back taxes, has not filed tax returns, and doesn't know what to do next, stop and listen. Not filing your taxes can have severe consequences, especially in this political climate. Now that COVID is over, the IRS is getting aggressive, massively increasing enforcement and collection efforts. With politicians making all sorts of promises, especially when it comes to taxes, hiding and not dealing with your taxes will cause you harsh legal and financial ramifications. But right now, the IRS offers forgiveness and writes off a massive amount of tax debt. The Tax Doctor offers a free service that helps people get out of IRS collections and back in good standing with the government. Don't hide or bury your head in the sand. Take advantage of our free service. Call now to learn more. 800-368-1307. 800-368-1307. 800-368-1307. That's 800-368-1307.
Why are independent election experts urging Californians to vote yes on Prop 50 this November? It's simple. Donald Trump and extreme Republican politicians are stealing congressional seats across the country, trying to rig the next election and give Trump nearly unchecked power. Prop 50 will put the election back on a level playing field, giving the people of California the power to approve temporary maps to counter Trump's power grab. Citizen redistricting commissioners, community groups, and President Obama all support Prop 50 because Prop 50 defends checks and balances, ensures that voters, not politicians, decide our elections, and reaffirms California's commitment to independent, nonpartisan redistricting for the long term. This November, defend democracy in all 50 states. Yes on Prop 50. Ad paid for by Yes on 50, the Election Rigging Response Act, Governor Newsom's Ballot Measure Committee. Ad Committee's top funders, Fund for Policy Reform and HMP for Prop 50.
Welcome back to the Captain's Table. I'm your host, Dawn Deckman-Moeller, and today we have Paul Mitchell. He's conducted redistricting for so many different states.
California, being the largest state, the state that has the best opportunity to kind of push back on this national move by Donald Trump, said, okay, well, if you're going to do that, we're going to counter it here. And create 5 Democratic districts where there are currently Republican members of Congress in order to counterbalance what you've done in Texas. And, that's what's in Prop 50 is it kind of does this thing where it embraces national redistricting reform. It says we're going to keep the commission, which it absolutely does. But for a 3 election cycle period, implements these new lines that are in everybody's voter guide that they can look at. And those lines would be used only for Congress, so legislative lines aren't touched. And then the whole thing expires after the 2030 election. In 2031, we'll have a new census. 2032, the commission will draw the lines again, as they were already scheduled to do after the next census. So as people go to the polls right now, that's the thing that's right in front of them is this, redistricting in California to counterbalance what they're doing in Texas. And it's been getting strong support. It looks as though it's likely to pass. There's different, we can talk about this further, but there's different ways to kind of evaluate, whether this thing is likely to win or lose after Election Day. And right now it looks like it's on the verge of winning.
You mentioned one word that, and I am not a politician, but I do understand census records. So who is what group is behind, how do we trust that the mapping is done correct and is a benefit for everyone in California? If the census is not until after I think you said 2031, which I understand census records. How do we draw the maps? I mean, give us some of your expertise on how that is a win-win for the entire population and not biased, I guess.
Yeah. So, so first off, the census is done every decade. That's maybe all cap census. When people think of the census, they think of the once a decade. They take everybody where they rested their head on April 1st, 2020. That is where they lived that day. And so we're going to, record that and use that as the basis for allocating congressional districts nationally. We're going to use that as the basis for drawing districts into a state, into a city redistricting, legislative, congressional, all that stuff. So all that data of the decennial census, the once every 10-year census, is what we use as the raw number of total people in an area when we draw districts. But the census actually goes on continually. It doesn't actually stop and only perform once a decade. Every year they survey about 3.5% of the national population in a thing that used to be called the long form of the census. But this ongoing American Community Survey allows us to continue to dive into the data, and specifically in redistricting, there's data we use for the Voting Rights Act considerations about the ethnicity of districts and how that ethnicity changes in order to make sure that that is being more updated. Now, what is weird about redistricting in mid-decade is that you are required by law to use the most recent census.
That's what I was curious about.
Yeah, I did redistricting in 2019 for a couple cities.
Okay.
And these are cities that went from at-large elections to districts. And we were in 2019 and we still had to use the 2010 census data. We were in some cases, a year and a half wait until we get the new census data. They were going to have to redistrict, basically before the next election cycle, but they were required to go to districts for the first time. And the only data you can legally use is the most recent census. So there's a little bit of a, concern that people might have about, well, are these districts truly equally sized? But that's also true if we didn't change the line.
Well, let me ask you a question.
Districts.
Oh, no, go ahead. Districts. Can you describe what makes a bona fide district in this particular topic?
Yeah. So in congressional redistricting, we are required to draw districts to a one-person deviation. This is kind of crazy, but it essentially means that every district has to be equally sized with, no more than one person above or one person below that kind of magical number. And every state, because they're different populations, has a slightly different kind of magical number. But our magical number in California is 760,066 people.
Oh.
So every district has to be 760,065 to 760,067 people. So that's a one person either side of that perfect number population. That is how we draw districts, is to equal population. But it's not just like write a computer program, give me districts that are all that equal size. You also need to consider things like, keeping communities of interest together, trying not to split cities and counties, trying to make districts that, look more like circles and squares than look like octopuses fighting, and then you also have to consider Voting Rights Act. Even though the Federal Voting Rights Act is potentially being challenged at a federal level in the courts, and it might be thrown out entirely or might be modified, the State Redistricting Commission drew maps where they identified 16 districts that are majority minority Latino districts. And so as we're drawing districts to try to achieve a partisan advantage to push back on Texas. And at the same time, trying not to undo what the commission did in terms of making sure that certain districts were still majority minority and that Latinos weren't having a weakness in their political voting power. So what is a challenge in our redistricting in California is that we are trying to achieve a partisan advantage for Democrats to push back on what they've done in Texas for Republicans. So the job is different than the job that the commission was created. However, we didn't want to do a redistricting where we just blindly go in and draw as many Republicans out of their districts as possible. It would have been possible in California, believe it or not, to draw all 52 Democrat districts to be districts Democrats could win. And there were people running around with maps that would show, look, we can draw 52 Democratic seats. But it would create the wackiest districts that split, all kinds of communities and had really straight, crazy lines. Because you'd have to basically, let's say a very Republican part of inland California, rural California, the Inland Empire, you would have to draw basically all these districts that put Kern in the same district as Santa Monica. Things like just nutty, crazy things.
Right.
And so we weren't willing to go to that extreme. We were only willing to go to push back on what Texas is doing. And picking up 5 seats, we were actually able to pick up 5 districts, reduce the numbers of cities that were split by 3. So we have 3 fewer city splits than the existing plan. We were able to, based on an analysis from Cal Poly Pomona and Caltech, we're able to improve the Voting Rights Act for Latinos in 2 key districts and create an additional district in which Latinos have the opportunity to elect a candidate of choice. And then, according to the Public Policy Institute of California, we were able to also, again, protect the status quo of the VRA districts that the commission created and create another district where Latinos are basically like they're they can be part of a coalition of other voters that are electing candidate of choice. Essentially both of those studies said that this plan protects the Voting Rights Act and potentially even improves the voting power for Latinos. And then UCLA, their Asian Studies Institute, put out a study saying that these plans improve voting power for the Asian community. So we're actually able to, and the historic Black districts in California, there's 1 in Oakland and 2 in Los Angeles. Those districts we didn't touch at all. We never even touched one census block in those districts. And most of the state, 80% of the voters are going to be voting in the same district as they were before. There are, 8 districts that weren't touched at all. There were 10 districts that were touched less than 5%. So it's really kind of, we were able to do this thing to create kind of minimum change around the state to push back on Texas while preserving communities of interest, leaving most of the commission map in place and, just doing enough to create a pushback for what is happening nationally. And again, temporary. It was only done because of what Texas did, and it goes back to the commission in 2032.
Well, I'm already learning more about Prop 50, and this is really fascinating. We are going to take, Paul, a real quick break for our wonderful sponsors, so please stand by. We'll be right back.
Why are independent election experts urging Californians to vote yes on Prop 50 this November? It's simple. Donald Trump and extreme Republican politicians are stealing congressional seats across the country, trying to rig the next election and give Trump nearly unchecked power. Prop 50 will put the election back on a level playing field, giving the people of California the power to approve temporary maps to counter Trump's power grab. Citizen redistricting commissioners, community groups, and President Obama all support Prop 50 because Prop 50 defends checks and balances, ensures that voters, not politicians, decide our elections, and reaffirms California's commitment to independent, nonpartisan redistricting for the long term. This November, defend democracy in all 50 states. Yes on Prop 50. Ad paid for by Yes on 50, the Election Rigging Response Act, Governor Newsom's ballot measure committee. Ad committee's top funders, Fund for Policy Reform and HMP for Prop 50.
Your addiction could cost you everything. Your job, your children, your loved ones, maybe even your life. Face it, you need help. Call Better Addiction Care now. It's time to end your addiction to drugs and alcohol. Help is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, no matter who you are, where you're located, or your financial situation. Our network of treatment centers can guide you before it's too late and you hurt yourself or your loved ones again. We're Better Addiction Care and can help put an end to your addiction. Plus, your insurance may cover up to 100% of costs. Don't wait another moment. Your life could depend on making the call right now. There's still time to get back what addiction is taken away. This could be the most important call of your life.
Call 800-247-0941. 800-247-0941. 800-247-0941. That's 800-247-0941.
Welcome back to the Captain's Table. I'm your host, Dawn Deckman-Moeller, and today we have Paul Mitchell, the owner of Redistricting Partners. He's conducted redistricting for so many different states and cities and school boards and colleges. So we are just kind of diving in and learn a little bit more about gerrymandering, or talking about the Voting Rights Act. And, I have a question. What did Texas do? That's what I want to know. Because if Texas had not, I guess you could explain what it is that they've done, would this domino effect not have happened in California?
Yeah. So first off, what happened is that after this most recent election, the presidential election, Donald Trump did a lot better in Texas than people thought. And it was largely because Latinos, particularly Latino men, particularly younger Latino men, supported Trump in larger numbers than, they had ever supported a Republican, at least in modern history. And this shift, which I think is largely attributable to Elon Musk and Joe Rogan and kind of that Manosphere podcast stuff, that shift elevated his vote totals in a lot of Texas that they didn't think was previously kind of good territory for Republicans.
Uh-huh.
And Donald Trump came into the state, met with, at least called into the state, talked with the governor, and said, hey, I deserve 5 more congressional districts in Texas. And the governor acquiesced, and the legislature, after some back and forth with Democrats leaving the state to try to deny quorum, and then ended up going back in the state because they had to pass the bill with, flood funding and stuff like that after those horrible floods in Texas.
Yes.
They ended up passing this redistricting plan on a partisan vote. And what this redistricting plan did was, based in the 2020 redistricting, they already drew districts to try to maximize the number of Republican seats. And some of the ways they did that would be to essentially go in around San Antonio and draw all the suburbs of San Antonio where there are more Republican districts and kind of separate those out in order to make more Republican seats, and then make the Democratic seats as heavily Democratic as possible, so that you're not wasting Republican votes in those areas. You're basically trying to put all the Republican voters into districts Republicans can win.
So was there timeline? Was there timeline? I know that you mentioned like a temporary change until the 2030 census. In Texas, are they on the same timeline? Are we on the same timeline nationally as with?
So the Texas redistricting is done by the legislature, not by a commission. And so they will have to redraw lines in 2032, but it's going to go right back to the same people that drew these lines. It's not going to go to a commission. That's the difference in California, is that this process of having any legislative involvement in the line drawing, or me drawing lines, or having partisanship be part of the criteria, all of that stuff is just a one-time thing. And the constitutional language about going back to the commission is true in California and Texas. After this is all over, they're just going to go back to the legislature again. In fact, in Texas, they could redistrict again in 2028 and again in 2030 if they wanted to.
Okay.
It's just different laws different states have. We don't have a national standard on redistricting.
Okay.
But what they did is they went in and they drew these 5 additional districts. Now, when they're drawing these additional districts, they're trying to, take a gerrymander and make it an extreme gerrymander to try to pack as many of these Democrats into as few districts as possible and create as many seats as for Republicans to win. And what's interesting is that when they first started doing this, the entire strategy that I was undertaking as a redistricting consultant, the entire strategy from the governor's office, members of Congress, everybody, was to try to stop Texas from doing this. This was the number one and only focus of our efforts, in kind of June, July, or whenever this was first starting.
Okay.
And it was so to the extreme that I actually went on 2 Sunday talk shows in Texas as like a California redistricting expert to talk about how California would draw new districts if Texas did, just to counterbalance them. They made very public statements. They had Hakeem Jeffries and Nancy Pelosi walking through the Capitol on their way to a meeting, right past all the media, saying we're going to have California redraw districts if Texas does. And there were members of the Texas delegation, believe it or not, both Democrats and Republicans, who were urging California to take this posture in hopes that Texas would say, okay, well, why would we mess up our districts if California's just going to undo it? Let's just stop here, have a ceasefire.
Yes.
And when that would made sense, right?
Yeah, make complete sense.
But they didn't. Maybe it was the don't mess with Texas. I have no idea. But, for some reason, they just said, well, the hell with it. We're going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And they went ahead and drew those districts. So California then implements this Prop 50 move to put it to the voters. Interestingly, Prop 50, the match in Prop 50 will be the most well-known, most publicized redistricting in U.S. history. It'll be the most known redistricting since the original gerrymander. We've never had a redistricting map mailed to 22 million voters before. We've never had a redistricting map voted on by the public like this before. And so where Texas's map was drawn by the legislature and passed without, the voters being able to decide anything, in California, we're going through this really enormous process with massive TV ads and protests and marches and homemade signs and everything to try to promote this redistricting plan. And so it's very different what's happening here in California. But it is, to your question, entirely the first domino was Texas moving and then California's reaction to that. California would not have done this if Texas had not done their redistricting.
So you would, or would you say that it's, back to the gerrymandering, it's all about politics? Yeah. The person at home that's getting ready to go vote, what's in it for them? On either side, bipartisan wise. What is in it for voting yes?
Well, what's in it for Americans and for, I think, the most kind of broad look at this is that we right now have a Congress that is not fulfilling its constitutional obligation to be a counter to the executive branch. We're supposed to have an executive branch, a judicial system, and a legislative branch that work well because they work, pushing back on each other, checks and balances against each other. And we already have a judicial branch in the Supreme Court that has seemed to be almost, a part of a team with the executive branch on a lot of these things. And that's something that we can't solve right away. But the legislative branch is something we can solve right away. They have been silent on so much of what is happening, to an unprecedented level. There's never been a time where Congress stood by as the president, shot up boats in the Gulf of Mexico, or there's never been a Congress who stood by and stayed quiet as a president exercised this unprecedented power with regards to tariffs. There's never been a Congress that stood by as the president suggests that, the Department of Justice pay him $230 million for his pain and suffering when he was, being investigated and prosecuted for crimes that he committed. So there's never been a Congress that stood by as a president sought to indict his political enemies and seek retribution in an open way. And so the fact is that even if you're a Republican, I think you can be concerned that we need to have a Congress that has checks and balances, and this Congress is not providing that. And if Donald Trump is successful in kind of packing these districts as Republicans, going around the country trying to change the architecture of our elections, he could theoretically have an unprecedented political power for the second portion of his 4-year term. And I think that could impair more things than we're willing to even kind of talk about in polite spaces. Meaning that, like, what is that going to mean for our election system coming 2028? What is that going to mean for our legal judicial system? What is that going to mean for, civil rights? And what is it going to mean for rule of law if we don't have a Congress that is willing to push back? So I think Democrats, they can be focused on the fact that what Republicans in Texas and Donald Trump are doing is trying to gain this unfair advantage before a midterm election, and we need to push back on that on a partisan level. But then even outside of the partisan level, just if you're an American, I believe even an objective American looking at our Congress right now can understand that the fealty that they have to the president is not a healthy democracy right now. We're not in a healthy functioning democracy when the executive branch can run roughshod over Congress. And it does need a refresh in Congress in order to create an institution that can push back. If Democrats take Congress, they're not going to be able to undo the Trump presidency. It's not going to be like they take Congress and Trump is no longer going to be president. It's just we're going to potentially level that playing field so that we do have checks and balances against the executive branch. And that's actually for the democracy, especially going into 2028 when, there have been concerns pushed by the president that, he might run for office again or he might not leave in 2028. And we can, I feel like that can be hyperbole, but he's the one that is promoting this for some reason, running around with Trump 28 hats, talking about it all the time, having his people like Steve Bannon say, well, get ready for it because Trump's going to be president after 2028. This kind of stuff is not healthy. And so I think even if you're, concerned from I'm a Republican, and I think this is a thing that's going after Republicans. I think part of it is that for the longevity of our democracy, we need to have a Congress that plays that checks and balances role. And so that's why I think, even some Republicans are supporting this, albeit most Republicans, it is a very partisan issue right now. Most Republicans will likely oppose it.
Well, Paul Mitchell, we're going to take a very quick break for our wonderful sponsors, and you are very knowledgeable in this area, and I'm sure our audience is enjoying listening to the show. So stand by for just a few minutes, and we'll be right back.
Why are independent election experts urging Californians to vote yes on Prop 50 this November? It's simple. Donald Trump and extreme Republican politicians are stealing congressional seats across the country, trying to rig the next election and give Trump nearly unchecked power. Prop 50 will put the election back on a level playing field, giving the people of California the power to approve temporary maps to counter Trump's power grab. Citizen redistricting commissioners, community groups, and President Obama all support Prop 50 because Prop 50 defends checks and balances, ensures that voters, not politicians, decide our elections, and reaffirms California's commitment to independent, nonpartisan redistricting for the long term. This November, defend democracy in all 50 states. Yes on Prop 50. Ad paid for by Yes on 50, the Election Rigging Response Act, Governor Newsom's Ballot Measure Committee. Ad committee's top funders, Fund for Policy Reform and HMP for Prop 50.
Hello and welcome back to the Captain's Table. This is our final segment with Paul Mitchell, the owner of Redistricting Partners, and I know a lot more, Paul, than I did about 40 minutes ago about Proposition 50 and just some of the history. And in doing so, I'm just making some notes. When I think about really going back to the census and kind of understanding the infancy stages of how these districts are drawn, I think about years ago, flying back and forth cross country and flying Southwest quite often and going over Vegas or, the Phoenix area. And I remember, goodness, one day I looked down, I said, what in the world? If I hadn't flown for a couple years and seeing, and this is going back, I think almost like 17 years ago, and seeing the growth of those cities. And today, with affordable housing in many different states, they're building, single or multi-dwelling units, apartment complexes, smaller homes. And, trying to make it affordable for, first-time home buyers. But you're seeing growth in a lot of areas. There's parts of the country where farmers have been selling the last, acres that they've had, and, family farms for 100 years to home builders. So these are the type of things that naturally play a role in redistricting down the road, where you have to get that 760,000, 65, 66 population to create new districts, typically, every so many years?
Yeah, so the population shifts that we'll have throughout the course of a decade, they can vary from, like you're talking about, visible population increases with new housing, cities spreading out in the suburbs and exurbs and that kind of growth, right? Then there's kind of an invisible population growth that you can see where you might just have an area that is getting more density without getting more housing. It's just that each house is going from an average of 2.3 residents per household to 2.4 residents or 2.5 residents per household. And so you have greater density without that visible, oh my gosh, look at that growth kind of vibe, because, you're driving down the street. You don't really know that there's more people in this apartment complex than there was 10 years ago, but there just is. And then there's things that impact that growth, like immigration. And this is, a census is conducted, and it counts all people. So it counts citizens and non-citizens. So legal and, undocumented residents in California or wherever they are in the country do count towards that total. So you have growth from that immigration. And then you also have growth from childbirth. Now, one of the challenges with childbirth population growth is that we have had declining population growth in the country, in California, in particularly more affluent areas, as people have gone from having kind of a quote unquote replacement rate of like each couple having like 2.3 kids or something like that, to a, much less than replacement rate of each couple maybe having on average 1.2 or 1 kid. And that means that as you're looking at the state's population, you have this population growth from newborns being countered by population loss from people, from people dying. And these things all work in, this over 10 years kind of movement of, that almost like the tides coming in and out of population growth, population loss, greater density, greater housing and cities spreading out. And all these things try to get encapsulated by the decennial census every 10 years. And so in the last redistricting in 2010, each district was 702,000. And now each district is 766,000. And maybe by the time we get to 2030, each district will be 780 or 800,000 people in each of them. But that population change is accounted for in the census. And then when you do that, it changes where those districts are. Congressional districts are unique, by the way, since we might have more or less in the next districting. We might have, 3 or 4 less is what people are projecting right now. But the other aspect is that, like, let's say congressional district includes, we'll just say, just kind of throw something out there. We'll say there's a congressional district that includes Sacramento.
Right.
Well, as Sacramento grows population, that district gets over and over and over populated. So when you do the redistricting, you actually have to shrink the geography of that district in order to get it back down to its original or to its proper size as being, 152nd the size of the entire state. Whereas if something's losing population relative to the rest of the state, that district has to physically grow to capture more area, capture more people to make it the right size. So you have this rescaling of congressional districts that happens every redistricting where because of population growth and shifts, you'll have districts kind of increasing or decreasing size. And then you sometimes have districts kind of moving around because, like, the commission in one redistricting might be drawing this district to make sure that an agricultural interest is able to elect the candidate of choice. But then in another redistricting, 5 or 10 years later, maybe they're more concerned about this urban area, and so they draw the districts differently. So there's all kinds of things that can impact the redistricting in addition to like what you're talking about, those population shifts.
So are there, and we're coming down to about 5 minutes left in our show, and when we get towards the end, I want to make sure people know where to get information on the redistricting and Prop 50, the pros and the cons, I guess. Are there certain counties or cities in California that should be more concerned that it's affecting their area versus, I'm just throwing out different towns, Modesto, Burbank, San Fernando Valley. I mean, are there certain areas that when I go to the polls, this is affecting me? I need to know that. I've been so busy working, take care of the kids, I haven't paid attention to my looking at my. So tell me about that, and then let us know. First of all, you're so well informed. I think that you should be on all of the channels as an expert, bipartisan, just talking about this, and I'm sure you will be.
I've been doing a bit, yeah.
This is so historic, But yeah, who should be really sitting down and having a cup of coffee and reading the pre-polling or when they vote from home or go in person?
Yeah. Well, so first off, everybody is going to be equally impacted by this at the macro level of,
got it.
Does California have the ability to push back on Texas? What's going to happen with Congress? What's going to happen around the rest of the country? What message does this send? So I think everybody can equally feel at this macro level that like this is something that they're, supportive of pushing back on Trump. And that's been interesting in that this is ostensibly a redistricting ballot measure, but for the most part, people aren't paying attention to the exact lines in the redistricting. They're more paying attention to what this means for Congress, what this means nationally, what this message this sends. Voters have been anxious to have a way to push back on the current administration. And so for this ballot measure is in a way providing that opportunity where previously there just wasn't much opportunity for people to do it other than maybe going to a march or something like that. So this has been a more effective way of pushing back. The areas of the state that have the greatest change, Northern California, if you're a resident in, the Santa Rosa area or something like that, there will be more significant change. Santa Rosa used to be split between two congressional districts in the old plan, and now it's unified in one. And that's an area where you have a district that was a safe Republican district that now is a district that looks like a safe Democratic district, the way it's redrawn. In the Sacramento area, you might find your districts change more because Kevin Kiley, who's one of the Republicans, has had his district drawn more into Sacramento, again, to make it a safe Democratic seat. And so you might wake up after Election Day and like, oh my gosh, I'm now in a district that Kevin Kiley's in. And if you're a Democrat, you're going to be maybe excited that like, oh, wait, we get to beat Kevin Kiley. That's going to be fun. In the Central Valley, there have been some changes, but more modest changes because we wanted to preserve the nature of these districts being in the Central Valley. We pushed back on efforts that other people were trying to do to draw districts that went from the Central Valley to the Central Coast, kind of left to right districts rather than north to south districts. But, so the nature of the congressional districts in the Central Valley is largely unchanged. Most people are still going to be in their same district. In the LA region, there's a couple things. One is that we put back into the LA region the historic Ed Roybal district. Lucille Roybal Allard held it after Ed Roybal. It was the first Latino majority minority district in the state, and the last commission had removed it and allowed kind of this collapsing of these districts in LA in order to balance population. We put it back in and then pushed the districts around through Long Beach, Orange County, into San Bernardino, Inland Empire, made it work essentially to have this district be put back into LA. So for LA residents, they're going to see potentially a little bit more change, especially live in like the Southeast cities. If you live in Orange County, there's been significant change so that now the congressional district that is the Long Beach district, where for years Alan Lowenthal, that used to be the Long Beach member of Congress, his district went into Orange County. The commission moved that district so it went into the Southeast cities. We changed it back so that it now goes back into Orange County again, this time down the coast into Huntington Beach and Newport. The districts in kind of Irvine, Orange County have been significantly changed. Riverside has seen one of the most significant changes because there used to be a district held by Ken Calvert in that area. His district was that one moved to Southeast LA. And so that his former district, half of it, which is the Corona side, has been moved into the Young Kim seat in Orange County. Mm-hmm. And then the other half of it, the Palm Springs side, has been moved into the San Diego area. And so throughout all those changes, I just kind of like walked through the map north to south. Those areas that I'm talking about are the ones that had the most change. You'll notice I didn't say anything about San Mateo or San Francisco or San Luis Obispo or, these areas along the Central Coast. Mm-hmm. Most of those districts are pretty much unchanged. And so that's because as we were drawing districts to try to achieve this partisan gain, we weren't going to really be able to draw a district that took the voters from San Francisco and put them with Redding, or to draw voters in Monterey and put them with Bakersfield. So, we largely kept all those districts unchanged. And so there will be a lot of, like I said, 80% almost of voters are going to see no change to who their representatives are. But those areas that I discussed are the ones that are going to see the most significant change to who their member of Congress is. And so that also cuts both ways. There might be some people who are like, oh, I love my member of Congress. I love Ken Calvert. Mm-hmm. Why do I have to have, this young Kim be my representative or something like that? But then there might also be just for every one of those, there might be people in Palm Springs who are like, hallelujah. We've been trying to beat Ken Calvert for all these years as a very progressive, high LGBTQ population. Now we're in a district that actually leans Democratic, a district that Kamala Harris won in 2024, one that we can actually put up a candidate and win in this next election to elect a representative, at least for the, time that those maps are in place, to elect a representative that better represents them. So you might find people looking these maps differently depending on their political posture or depending on where they are physically in the state.
Well, that was extremely informative for me, and I know for our audience. And this does wrap up our show, Paul. And quickly, is there any last words you'd like to tell to the voters out there?
Return your ballot. I'm sure if you're listening to this, you probably are an active voter, but return your ballot. Do it today. Don't wait until Tuesday. There's no need to let kind of a life event like, yesterday or a couple of days ago, we had a bunch of plans and my wife and my daughter both got sick. If that had been election day, maybe we wouldn't have returned our ballots because we didn't go to the polling place.
There you
go. Because, life intervenes sometimes. So I think the number one thing is for people to vote and vote early. If you vote early, you at least know your ballot's in. If you vote early by mail, in most counties, you get a little text message back, or you can sign up with the Secretary of State's office to get a text message that'll tell you exactly where your ballot is in process and let you know when your ballot's been counted.
Well, Paul Mitchell, tell me what your website is so people can go look at that too.
Oh, well, I'm sure there's a Yes on Prop 50 website. I don't actually work for the campaign, so I have not been involved in that, but you could definitely Google that. There's a No on Prop 50. My company is called Redistricting Partners. There's also the other company I work with is Political Data, politicaldata.com. One of the things you can get at politicaldata.com is you can look and see who's returned their ballots. There's an early vote tracker. You can see over 4 million people return their ballots as of, the middle of the week prior to the election. And we'll be probably, into the 7-8 million people have returned their ballots by Monday. So you can look and see that stuff if you're interested in learning more about who's voting in this election.
Paul Mitchell, thank you so much for being our guest today on the Captain's Table. You can view this show on demand on Facebook, Spotify, Buzzsprouts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast shows. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening and have a great day. Bye-bye.